Lucerne asked why she was crying and if she was scared, and the girl thought that his hand was very warm and pleasant. Although his voice and facial expressions seem cold, when he is around her, he looks completely different. And while this man is next to her, she absolutely does not understand her feelings, and now she wants to kiss him. After a few minutes, they broke off their passionate kiss to take a closer look at each other's eyes and lips. Suddenly, the general asked if they had met before, a question that made Elisha flinch. He explained that every time she looked at him, her eyes seemed filled with guilt. The man then frowned and asked suspiciously what she was hiding, calling her a little ghost along the way. However, a loud stomping outside the door prevented the girl from answering, causing them both to turn around in surprise. A loud voice of a knight was heard from behind the door, calling for the general, saying that monsters were approaching from behind the mountains. Having quickly dressed, Lucerne asked his wife to stay here for now and not to go out until he gave her permission. Usually, these creatures go berserk in the spring, under the influence of the power of magical stones, but suddenly they appeared now. The knight explained that the uprising was to blame for everything. Most likely, the survivors of the fallen kingdom awakened the monsters. The Soji estate has already been captured, and it looks like they're planning to take control of the area around the gate. Elisha knew that the rebellion would fail in any case, and the status of Lucerne, which had suppressed it, would rise significantly. The surrounding territories were ready to send reinforcements, but the commander-in-chief's position was still vacant. They have a week to get the job done, but Lapis noticed that the general was in a very bad mood. Corin replied that it was understandable that he was interrupted on his wedding night, although what could such a boy know? Ian and Lasley would go with Lucerne, while Nora, Corin, and Lapis were tasked with delivering his wife to the capital. The guys immediately started insisting that it was unfair, since the three of them should be responsible for the escort. The general did not like this tone, which made him angry and asked if he had allowed them to say anything. Elisha watched in surprise as an irritated Lapis, dissatisfied with the order, looked after the general. The girl smiled and nodded at him, but the wizard decided to ignore her, turning away angrily. She understood that for knights such treatment was tantamount to exile, and it was strange to expect any other reaction. He asked Lucerne to watch her behavior when she arrived in the capital, and to remember that they were not finished yet. He then asked her to be ready the night he returned, so that they could continue what they had started. The girl looked worried, and then wished him luck, knowing that they would not see each other for a long time. A couple of days later, they arrived in the capital, approaching the Lucerne estate, which was simply huge. When Elisha got out of the carriage, she couldn't take her eyes off the mansion, trying to see everything at once. At that very second, someone pushed her painfully in the shoulder, after which she noticed Lapis walking discontentedly. And for everyone here, she is just a big woman, only in words having noble status, being the wife of a general. A butler came out to her and called himself Henri, adding that if she needed anything, she could contact him. The girl took a deep breath, after which she tried to convince herself that everything was okay and she could handle it, after which she told the butler that she wanted to see the training ground where the knights train. The man was surprised by such a sudden request, since the new owner of the house had not even had time to properly settle in yet. When asked if she was sure, Elisha answered yes, deciding that she would show everyone that she could be useful too. Henry said that the training ground was not a place for a noble lady like her to visit. Most of the soldiers are still absent due to the current situation, and the troops are now under the command of a general. He advised her to take a look at the residence after hearing the question of whether the site was part of it. Suddenly, the butler started, bowed, and said that he had gone too far, and then offered to show him the way. After some time, they reached the training ground, when suddenly the soldiers immediately noticed the girl from the rumors. They whispered among themselves that they thought the general would be all alone for the rest of his life. Then, Henry led the girl into the kitchen, showing her everything and introducing her to the cook, saying that food for the soldiers was prepared here. Elisha immediately began to study the menu, asking if they would be serving this today, and the chef nodded in the affirmative. Henry, meanwhile, noticed Elisha's straight posture, but rough hands, as well as a face completely devoid of emotion. He thought that she was the same as all those fallen aristocrats who were left with only useless pride. However, now he had to admit that his judgment was wrong, and now she looked like a mistress. Elisha listened to the cook with a serious expression, drawing some conclusions for herself, hoping to improve the soldiers' conditions. A little later, Henri said that because of the small number of servants, the house might seem untidy to her. However, they paid special attention to preparing the room for the lady so she should rest from the journey. He was told that, having crossed the gate, they found themselves here in just 2 days, and such a long journey must have tired her. Suddenly, they heard a loud cry in front of them, and someone was asking if it was really that hard to follow the pig. Meanwhile, the fleeing animal, with a mark on its hip, stopped abruptly, looking at the girl in shock. Lapis immediately pounced on the pig, asking if it would continue to escape from his lab. Elisha immediately gave him a good-natured smile, but the guy only responded with a displeased look. A surprised Henri shouted after the displeased wizard that he should have greeted his mistress. The butler asked not to be angry with him, because he was only 14 years old, but he was already one of the 97 wizards. The girl calmly replied that she understood everything and knew that there was no point in forcing wizards to be polite. The stunned butler asked if she had ever had to deal with them before, since she knew their habits. Elisha didn't answer, but instead just smiled, leaving the butler to ponder the matter. When they entered the mansion, the girl was shocked by what was happening inside. There was the famous Fivachan world clock, which counted time for another 533 years, according to the imperial calendar. She also noticed flowers forged from pure gold, and even the vase underneath them was an ancient and valuable relic. And each of the paintings is a masterpiece, a cherished dream of any collector, which costs an unrealistic amount of money. However, now she was trying to understand what the hell was going on with the house itself, which was in disarray. Henri explained that every time a general returned victorious, he was given something valuable as a reward. However, as a person who is absolutely not interested in art, he doesn't care where these gifts are. He asked her not to worry, as the things that were truly important were kept in the treasury. If they can't take proper care of the valuables in front of them, it's scary to imagine what's going on in the treasury. At that very moment, Elisha rolled up her sleeves, saying that things wouldn't go this way, and the first thing she would do was clean up. Several days later, the butler still could not believe that the house could have been transformed so much in 3 days. Now the interior of the mansion was shining, and it seemed as if there was much more space in the room. He remembered asking her on the very first day if she was going to go and greet the servants in person. Elisha replied that, instead of distracting them from their work, it would be better if she came to them herself. After this, the girl walked around the mansion, studying the rooms, while at the same time greeting the surprised servants. Suddenly, one of the maids accidentally caught a vase and closed her eyes, deciding that this was the end for her. But when she opened her eyes, she noticed that Elisha had caught her, asking her to be careful in the future. The maid could not believe that she did not receive a reprimand, but on the contrary, she felt cared for by her mistress. Henri thought that although only a little time had passed, the atmosphere in the mansion had changed significantly. He was sure that it was all because the house finally had a mistress who really knew her business. Elisha, I said. After checking the trading book, she noticed that it would be possible to reduce costs a little more. When asked if she knew how to read a trade book, she replied that the abbess of the monastery, Rosaria, had taught her. The man asked if it was possible that she was talking about that very war heroine, after which everything became clear to him. Suddenly, he realized that he had only just now noticed how incredible, very smart, and insightful the lady was. In fact, the more he learns about her, the more amazed he is, and it was all in a positive way. It will be interesting to see how much this house, and along with it all its inhabitants, will change under her influence. Meanwhile, in the knight's dining room, they said that she was running everything as if she had lived there for 10 years. Lapis listened with displeasure, as they said that Layla praised her for her kindness to the servants. His ears almost withered. While everyone continued to discuss Elisha, the young wizard could barely contain his anger, but his patience came to an end. Then he suddenly jumped up, shouting that he didn't care whether it was the mistress of the house or anyone else, but he couldn't recognize her. Meanwhile, Elisha herself walked confidently into their dining room to greet them personally. Corin put his arm around Lapis's shoulder, asking with a sly smile how he could swallow such food. If all this had dried up, it would have definitely looked like the food given to prisoners 9 times out of 10. Nora asked him to stop being picky. He replied that no one could understand someone who had been in prison. It would be another matter if they were given such food on the battlefield. Then at least he could feel better. Then he would have cut down the rebels one by one. But now he wondered why the hell they weren't invited there. He didn't understand what was so special about what they needed to protect here in the mansion, and this question angered Lapis again. He shouted that he was already furious that they had separated him from Lasley, and now he had to drag himself here on a day off. Because of her, he cannot go to the battlefield, and therefore, whether the mistress of the house or anyone else, he will never recognize her. At that very moment, the door opened, and the wizard noticed with surprise that Elisha had come here completely alone. Earlier, Elisha told Henri that today was the day when the general was supposed to dine with his knights. Normally, she would sit there next to him, but since he is absent now, she goes there alone. The butler was surprised, asking if she was sure that this behavior might seem rude and inappropriate to her. The girl replied that during the time spent in the mansion, she had already met many friendly subordinates. None of them were cruel or used foul language, and they all obeyed her orders. Henry wondered whether he should tell her that they had been forced to observe elementary standards of decency. Hearing that they were friendly, he decided to ask her if she was sure they were talking about the same people. He decided to clarify that Ian was on the verge of drug poisoning, Nora was secretive, and Corin was in prison. It was quite funny to hear all this from him, because he himself used to be a knight who became famous as an executioner. Corin was surprised that she laughed. In her place, ordinary aristocrats would have definitely been frightened and started shedding tears. He was struck by the courage of the girl who approached the table and greeted the knights and the wizard with a smile. Alicia asked Lapis in surprise why he was here. The boy asked in response if there was any problem with it. She replied that, according to paragraph 73, on the 4th Tuesday of the month, he has the right not to appear anywhere. And since today is just that Tuesday, she will ask the servant to bring food to him so that he can dine in his room. She had heard that it was extremely important for wizards to spend time alone, as magic was an important field. His eyes lit up, and he asked if she would tell the general the same thing so he wouldn't get into trouble. Meanwhile, Corin was trying to figure out what was wrong with this girl, deciding that she was just trying to please him. Suddenly, Alicia walked right up to him, causing the man to immediately frown in disbelief. Frowning, the girl noticed the disgusting combination of products, deciding to tell the chef to change the menu. The guy looked at her in surprise, wondering if she really knew what such a choice of products meant. He suddenly froze, whispering to ask if she had been in that place by chance, but Elisha did not understand him. Lost in thought, Corin tried to describe the prison room to her in a veiled manner, but with little success. The girl remembered that shortly before his death, when Jacob was accused of drug trafficking, all the blame was placed on her. Then she spent several days in prison, after which she was bought out, paying a small bail, like for a slave. However, she replied to the guy that she had only heard a little about it, but nothing more. Elisha added that he had already suffered enough, being unfairly imprisoned, so she should take care of it. Corin was surprised that she already knew that he had been imprisoned because of a false accusation by an aristocrat. The girl then suggested that they eat a normal meal, adding that, fortunately, there were many different dishes on the table. After a slight hesitation, Corin decided to ask if the noble lady was afraid of him. These words surprised her very much. There was no fear on her face as she asked if she really should be afraid of her husband's knights. The guy realized that her way of thinking was completely different from other girls, which surprised him. When the table was set with a variety of dishes, Alicia immediately announced that they could begin eating. At the sight of this beauty, Corin immediately began to drool as he loudly thanked the lady for the treats. A little later, as the girl was walking down the corridor, Lapis was heading towards her with books and scrolls in his hands. When the boy saw Alicia, he froze, not knowing how to communicate with her after she had done a good deed for him. She asked if he should send a man to help her, but he asked to voice the 12th point of his contract. The girl replied that no one could touch the wizard's materials until he gave his consent. Having dropped all his things on the floor, the guy immediately asked what point 33 meant, wanting to check her. She replied that it spoke of notifying the wizard 2 days before any significant events in the master's life. Lapis asked in surprise if she had read his entire employment contract, to which she responded in the negative. He looked at the lady with distrust, realizing that she would not have been able to read all this in such a short time. But at that very second, the girl said with a smile that she had learned it, and this statement stunned the wizard. The guy asked with displeasure whether this meant that there was no need to inform the ordinary knights of the order about anything. Elisha replied that she had not been able to inform them of the wedding. They must have heard that it had been arranged in a hurry. Turning around, the wizard asked if she was apologizing to him only because she had not been able to tell him. He immediately remembered when he and Losley were freezing, and he promised to take revenge on the adults who did this to them. Elisha said that she was asking for understanding. Because it was her mistake, she was unable to fulfill one of the conditions of his agreement. She was in no position to invite anyone to the wedding, so she asks him to understand her situation. These words made the boy cry unconsciously, while she looked at him with a good-natured smile. Looking at her, he tried to understand who she was, because literally, from the morning, he did not want to accept her as a mistress. Meanwhile, in another part of the country, a war was raging, where knights fought with various monsters. Lucerne was covered in blood from head to toe, but his gaze was the same as always, warlike. Now he felt at ease, and on his face shone an evil smile, warning his enemies. That same evening, Elisha sat in the living room reading a book by candlelight, enjoying complete solitude. Suddenly, the butler approached her, placing another candle next to her, thereby surprising the mistress of the house. He said that reading books was, of course, useful, but she should take care of her eyes, and she replied that she would take that into account. He then said that he had received information from the front, and it looked like the war would last longer than expected. She already knew about it. Although Lucerne wanted to finish everything in a week, everything would not go according to plan. But because of the wizards who resorted to using stones, the situation became more complicated with the appearance of monsters. Therefore, the war would drag on for another 2 months. But Henri was confident that the general would definitely return soon. But before that, he asked to give her a medicine that was completely harmless to her health, as a dietary supplement. Elisha looked at the bottle and replied that she would take it a week before the general's arrival next month. Henri was dissatisfied with this answer, as he was sure that the gentleman could return at any moment. The girl interrupted him, saying that it was enough to drink the medicine a week before they went to bed. The man immediately became embarrassed and cleared his throat, not expecting her to know what this medicine was for. Elisha added that it was better to avoid unnecessary rumors now, which caused Henri to apologize and wish her good night. As he walked out the door, he remembered that she had said that she would take the medicine a week before the general returned, after which he began to wonder if this meant that she knew exactly when he would return. But how would she know? Elisha thought she was going to do it herself, but being told so bluntly brought her back to harsh reality. The birth of a child to a couple who signed a contract was absolutely impossible, which promised many problems. It's been a month since she arrived here, but she can't relax for a moment. She has to stay strong. Initially, before Lucerne left, Elisha thought that he was interested only in her body, but it is unknown whether his intentions will remain the same after he returns from the war as a winner. In any case, we need to focus on holding out until this man becomes the leader. Then Elisha will find freedom, and perhaps she will finally have the family she has dreamed of for so long. But for a person whose goal is survival, such dreams are too much of a luxury right now. All she can do is hope that all the terms of the deal will be met, and Lucerne will calmly give her a divorce. Looking out the window, the girl with a confident look firmly declared to herself that it was time to return to reality. Elisha spent the following days going about her daily business, while simultaneously establishing a relationship with Lapis. They managed to become good friends and spent a lot of time together, despite their personal affairs. The mistress of the house also spent a lot of time with other knights, wanting to get to know them as closely as possible. As the time approached for Lucerne's return, Elisha began to take the medicine brought by Henri. There were only a few days left before the arrival, which is why the mansion was in full swing with work, which was managed by Elisha herself. Suddenly, a joyful Henri ran into the room, declaring that the war was over and the gentleman was planning to return tomorrow. It was the last call for the girl, who understood that time was running out and he would soon return. Meanwhile, people celebrated the Empire's victory, saying that the general had cut as many as 500 monsters in half with his sword. Others also happily replied that it would be no problem for him to chop off 20,000 heads. But there were other rumors as well. He was forced to go to war instead of enjoying his honeymoon with his wife. At the same time, in the estate of the Marquis of Fulman, Carol's parents, the girl complained that she was very upset. She cried, declaring that Lucerne had been deceived, and now she was beside herself, worrying about the general. The Marquise replied that they, too, could not believe that Lucerne had married the girl who had recently washed their clothes. The Marquis also calmly added that she was from a fallen family, the name of which now played no role. Suddenly, he angrily declared that if there was a chance to show her his place, he was ready to do everything possible for this. The Marchioness asked what he was saying, since Carol could handle it perfectly well herself, just as she had taught her. At that very moment, the girl smiled, saying that in fact an interesting thought had come into her head. She then stated that she would solve the problem herself, showing everyone that she was not someone who could be treated like that. Radiating an ominous aura, Carol politely asked her father to lend her a few men to do the dirty work. That same evening, Elisha stood in front of the mirror, examining her appearance and preparing to meet her husband. She remembered his words when he asked her to be ready on the night he returned, so that they could finish what they had started. Slowly pulling off her robe, the girl thought that he was just joking then, and just scared her a little. Suddenly, she jumped up. I heard some strange sound, but I didn't understand where exactly it was coming from. Then she noticed the door, which had always been locked before, but was now slightly open. At that very moment, Lucerne came out from behind that door, stunning Alicia with his sudden appearance. The girl was embarrassed and didn't know what to say. The man frowned and asked why she was so surprised. She replied that she had heard that he would return tomorrow, and that the soldiers were supposed to hold a ceremonial parade. Lucerne replied that, as planned, the soldiers would pass through the gates at dawn, and he had things to do. Elisha wondered what urgent matter had forced the general to leave his soldiers and come here so early. The man calmly replied that it was an old promise, but it seemed that she still remembered it very well. The girl immediately understood what was being discussed, which is why she blushed and became embarrassed again, not answering. Unable to bear it any longer, she loudly explained that she was simply getting ready for bed and did not expect him to come today. She then asked why he appeared from there, glancing at the always locked door, which was open. She explained that until now the door had been locked and had never been opened. At that very moment, the man approached her. Then Elisha concluded that his office was there, and only he had the right to visit that room. Suddenly, Lucerne grabbed the girl by the shoulders, after which he gently threw her onto the bed, which she did not expect. He explained that this bedroom used to belong to him, but now it became the bedroom of a married couple. Looking into his eyes, she thought she was afraid of them. They looked as if they were ready to swallow her up in an instant. The girl decided to remind him that he would probably have to go to the gates tomorrow morning and meet the soldiers, which is why she suggested that he go to bed instead of fulfilling that same old promise. However, the man came even closer to her, asking where she was going, and her heart immediately started pounding. Elisha clutched the sheet tightly as the general moved so close she could feel his breath. When they kissed, the girl thought that it deprived her of any ability to think clearly. Suddenly, he lay down on her lap, saying that because of the victory parade, he had no more than 2 hours left to sleep. And even if she is upset, she needs to be patient a little longer, after which he will devote all his time to her. Smiling, the general said that he would soon fulfill his promise, so she did not need to worry about it. Alicia thought he would go all the way. Maybe because she was so surprised, her heart was still pounding. Then she asked if she would be allowed to go outside the mansion, because she did not expect such a ban. Lucerne replied that he thought the war would not end quickly, and that he had not been informed that she had tried to escape. After that, he said that she would be able to go out tomorrow afternoon, and such simplicity surprised the girl. Closing his eyes, the general invited her to eat together, to which he received a surprised but affirmative answer. He added that if she wanted, she could go out at other times, as the ban was no longer in effect. Looking closely at the sleeping man, Elisha concluded that he was indeed a very strange person. The next morning, as the sun illuminated the room, the girl began to slowly awaken from her sleep. Sitting up, she tried to remember when she had managed to fall asleep, and even end up under the covers. She noticed an empty seat next to her, feeling as if everything that had happened had been a dream. After breakfast and getting ready, she headed to the prepared carriage, where the Knights of the Black Lion were already waiting for her. She was asked to be careful because the parade could be very crowded, and there would be no room to move. Alicia apologized to Ian and Nora, but he replied that most people didn't like the palace receptions anyway. The girl said that before she went to where they would eat, she had to stop in somewhere else. It shouldn't take long, and she got permission from the general, so there shouldn't be any problems. After some time, the carriage arrived at a small building, and two men were meeting them near the entrance. After letting Elisha in, they said that the knights would have to wait outside, and they immediately became indignant. Nora refused with a displeased look, explaining that the parade would soon begin, and there would be a lot of people everywhere. Elisha quickly stopped her, saying that everything was fine, promising that she would finish within 10 minutes. Ian reluctantly agreed, but asked her to promise in return that she would never leave the store. Nodding, the girl headed inside Spencer's brokerage company, where she wanted to resolve a couple of her issues. This agency is an expert in the real estate market and conducts dozens of purchase and sale transactions daily. So it's no surprise that they have such tight security, but Lucerne must not know about her purchase. In the office, she was met by a gray-haired man who greeted her politely, asking if she was looking for anything specific. Alicia replied that she was very interested in a piece of land located near the enchanted forest of Ulif. The man was surprised, saying that it would soon be put up for auction, but that was not what the lady would be looking for. She has been there before, and she is interested in buying the place, not in a short-term investment. Lost in thought, the broker showed her documents, where the price of the land was slightly higher than she had expected. The only thing that interested the girl now was that it could help make Lucerne the head of the Cartier family. The man thought that it would be impossible for a simple noble lady to possess such information. Then he rose up, declaring that he would tell her something, but only because she looked like a knowledgeable person. He reported that after the previous owner of the land disappeared, a rumor began to spread that it only brought misfortune. If she wants a country house so badly, he can offer several much better options. Smiling, Elisha replied that she liked this land because the whole city was full of hot springs, and maybe he'll be lucky enough to find one if he digs in that area. The man decided that this lady had no plan at all. Elisha thought that if their conversation ever reached Lucerne's ears, it would be a good excuse. Unable to bring enough arguments, the broker said he would send her detailed information to the address. The girl was about to leave when she suddenly dropped the basket of documents, stopping when she noticed a brochure. The man explained that it was a luxury mansion for single women, and if she was interested, he would send her information. She agreed, because it would be nice to immediately find a place for a quiet life after the divorce from Lucerne. Sometime later, she reached the square where the parade was starting, trying to push her way through the crowd. There were a lot of people, but she was able to get closer. Noticing that the parade was about to begin, horsemen began to pass in front of her, proudly holding pennants in their hands, while others shouted that the general had won. Everyone was shouting praises in his direction, while Lucerne himself was on the balcony, next to some girl. He couldn't see Alicia, who had merged with the crowd that was shouting that he was always standing guard over their empire. The girl looked attentively at her husband, while others asked for Saint Ondine's blessing for him. The general waved to everyone, while the girl wondered if this was really the same man she had seen the night before. If they hadn't agreed to have lunch today, she would have really thought that all this was a dream. Now he is so close, but at the same time there is a huge gap between them, preventing them from meeting. She suddenly started, telling herself that she had imagined that they had just met each other's eyes for a moment. Then she turned around abruptly, deciding that in such a crowd it was simply impossible, which is why she decided to leave. Meanwhile, Ian and Nora were trying to get through to her, shouting that there were a lot of people here and that she needed to go to the back gate. Barely audibly, she replied that she understood everything. After which, having emerged from the crowd, she quickly headed towards the alley. The place was practically deserted. Only two vagabonds were there, not interested in the parade. Walking forward, the girl thought that she had simply entered an alley, but it suddenly became so deserted and quiet. Suddenly, someone crept up to her, covering her mouth with his hands so that she could not scream or call for help. They then dragged her further down the alley, pushing her to the ground, telling each other that she needed to be held down properly. Two guys started to rip her dress, asking if they could really do that since she was an aristocrat. Another answered in the affirmative, adding with a smile that they had been told to ruin her appearance and leave her here. She looked at their faces, when suddenly she felt that their strength began to float, and her vision was failing her. When she saw the reaching hands, she thought that the faint smell of nutmeg was being used as a hallucinogen. It seems that these people are not professionals, because they did not teach that it takes time for it to work. She decided that while she was still able to move, she had to run, after which she sharply kicked one of them in the groin. Gathering her remaining strength, Elisha began to run away as fast as she could, while the boys tried to figure out what was going on. The girl thought that if someone were to recognize her now, the general's wife, ridicule would definitely be inevitable. Stopping for a moment, she decided that she needed to come to her senses somewhere secluded and private. Her vision was still blurry, and the drug was starting to take effect more strongly as she crawled out of the alley. Elisha looked up in shock when she heard a familiar voice asking what kind of look she had. The ladies asked to see the general's wife, who decided to arrange a surprise by showing up at their meeting. But Arian said with a smile that this couldn't be. It was probably a courtesan who had run away from her client. Elisha knew that she was finished, because she presented herself in this form in front of Arian, who would not miss it. Suddenly, she felt a very heavy fabric fall onto her shoulders. It was a military uniform. Lucerne asked how she could have slipped out of the room in the middle of the trial, which required a search for her. All the girls were surprised by his appearance, but the most surprised and dissatisfied among them was Arian. Elisha's body went completely numb, leaving her only able to look at him and somehow say his name. Unable to bear it, she fell, but the man immediately caught her, while the ladies surrounding them watched. The general said that the effect had not yet worn off, asking if she had really felt so good that her legs had no strength. She tried to answer something, but the man stopped her, saying that he was also at his limit, and looked around. While the ladies were whispering, he picked up his wife in his arms, offering to return, adding that she would be punished. At that very moment, Arian stopped them, deciding to ask what these two were doing right on the street. She swallowed, taking in the rather open appearance of Elisha as she sat in the general's arms. Lucerne replied that they had intended to dine together, but before they got there, they were overcome with passion. Hearing this, the ladies immediately began to whisper and laugh. After all, they were newlyweds. What can you say? Wanting to hurry, the man said that they still had unfinished business, so they would leave them. Lying on his shoulders, Elisha thought that, thanks to Lucerne, she had managed to escape danger from Orion. But it seems that she will never pay for the rest of her life for the fact that such an important person was pulled out of the parade. Elisha could hardly speak, but she tried to ask how he knew, and how he was able to find her. With a serious face, the man asked in response whether she thought the mark on her neck was just a decorative element. The knights informed him of her disappearance, but it was quite problematic to come immediately because of the parade. Now they are in the hotel where they were going to meet her. The surprised employees began to whisper. He then asked what had happened, and Elisha replied in a barely audible voice that she had been suddenly attacked by two vagabonds. She herself thought that Lucerne had decided to leave right in the middle of the event just to find her. She also told him that she smelled nutmeg and cloves while she was wondering why he did it. The general concluded that it was a paralytic agent and waved his hand, calling the worker over. Then he asked her not to say anything more, since her tongue must already be very stiff. Elisha almost fainted, thinking that he was worried about her, but that simply couldn't be true. A few hours later, she woke up from her sleep and sat up to see Lucerne with a tray in his hands. He offered her to drink cocoa with alcohol. This should help her come to her senses in the shortest possible time. The man watched as his wife slowly took sips, but her body still barely obeyed. Then he turned his gaze to the door, through which Ian and Nora flew in, worried, addressing the lady. At that very moment, the general released his shadows, which immediately attacked the knights, painfully knocking them off their feet. The man became angry, asking them to try to find an excuse for themselves, because something like this was unacceptable. The knights immediately began to apologize, adding that they would humbly accept any punishment for this terrible mistake. Elisha said that in that situation, no one could have imagined that everything would turn out this way, and only she was to blame. Lucerne shouted that it was not up to her to decide who would bear responsibility, but seeing her trembling, he immediately fell silent. Clutching his face, the dissatisfied general asked if the attackers looked like vagabonds. If those people are connected to Jacob or Marco, they must be dead already, and we need to find them. He ordered to search for the corpses of people who had no relatives. The knights understood the order and left. Lucerne sat down on the bed next to Elisha, touching her and asking how she was feeling. Her appearance left much to be desired, but she replied that it became a little easier to move her tongue, but it was as if weights were still tied to her arms and legs. But she didn't have time to finish speaking, feeling a kiss. After a few seconds, the man moved away, smiling and saying that it was very sweet. Elisha was embarrassed when the general said that he would help her arms and legs get rid of the numbness very quickly. The girl immediately understood the hint, while Lucerne was saying that if her body warmed up, her feelings would return. Kissing her, he added that the closer you get to the center of the body, the faster the feelings awaken. Looming over her, Lucerne said that by now, rumors would probably be spreading everywhere. Everyone was saying that they had secluded themselves here to enjoy each other, so they couldn't leave. Elisha agreed. If it was necessary to get rid of the paralysis, Lucerne began to undress. Hanging over the embarrassed girl, the man said with a smile that he had been patient for 2 whole months and had been waiting for this. With a trembling hand, she touched his body, after which the general asked her to look him straight in the eyes. Elisha remembered Jacob in her past life, asking how they dared invite this bastard here. Sitting at the family table, he angrily added that Lucerne was a member of the imperial family and was targeting their lineage. The head replied that they were all the same, that he was the one insulting the family, and that Marco was the one conspiring with the temple. The general asked with a smile if they wanted them all to repent together, now, after so many years, after which a verbal altercation began. But at that moment, Marco was touching Elisha's leg under the table. She suddenly started and looked up when she noticed Lucerne's gaze on her. Turning away, the girl thought sadly that this man had just noticed her in this form. The chief gave Lucerne a final warning, adding that he would not be so merciful in the future. The smile disappeared from the general's face, after which he slowly stood up, clutching the bottle of wine tightly in his hand. Pouring wine on Marco's head, he said he had no business being in a family that displayed such behavior. He had fun with the hired killers he sent to him, and then asked them to wait for a return gift. Without thinking twice, the man headed towards the exit, while the whole family, including Elisha, silently watched him go. Carol said she saw it all, asking how such a man could even exist, and she wanted him. Then she told Elisha that she had an important job for her, because she had to do everything for her. After this, the girl opened her eyes, realizing that she had fallen asleep, after which she noticed Lucerne next to her. He touched her cheek, asking if she had a nightmare, and at first she thought she was still sleeping. She thought that both in that dream about the past and now, this man saved her, spitting on his reputation. Elisha didn't know if it would be a mistake to assume that he was treating her with tenderness or was just playing a role. She lowered her head onto his hand, deciding that it frightened her, while the man watched her closely. Then he said with a smile on his face that it was hard for her, so he held back and stopped at one time. But if she keeps looking at him like that, he'll have no choice but to continue. Sometime later, they went down to the first floor of the hotel, and the eyes of the others were riveted on them. They both froze, as Elisha thought that they had ended up staying in bed together until the morning. Although the effects of the substance had long since worn off by that time, Lucerne was still full of strength and energy. Looking at her husband, she thought that he seemed completely unconcerned with the views of other people. Suddenly, Lucerne was called out by a young, fair-haired girl in a snow-white dress uniform with a cloak on her back. I immediately recognized Elisha as the only princess of the empire, Ilione, and the most influential figure. She approached the general and asked with a smile what had happened yesterday, since she and her mother had been waiting for him so much. She is now a serviceman in the active army and the main representative of the imperial family. When Ilione looked at her, Elisha curtsied, greeted the princess, and stated his name. However, behind her smile, she was worried, because this girl was the one who would propose to Lucerne in 5 years. Although the proposal was made for political purposes, their relationship is such that there could have been other reasons. The princess told him that if he missed this meeting, his father would certainly be angry and displeased. The general replied without much enthusiasm that she would try not to be late, but could not promise anything. Smiling awkwardly, Ilion said she was sorry, because yesterday she had hoped that Lucerne would introduce his wife. Alicia realized that if she was talking about yesterday, then she was probably talking about the dinner to which Lucerne had invited her. He asked her to be sure to come to his palace, because he wanted to talk to her without rushing anywhere. Now she realized that he was not going to eat with her, but to introduce her to the princess without warning her in advance. Some time later, the carriage with Lucerne went straight to the royal palace for a personal meeting. The maid who was in Elisha's room said that the master immediately left for a meeting at the palace. If he had already gone there, he would not return for several days, which upset the girl a little. Lying in bed, she thought about what was happening to her lately and what was happening to her feelings. She decided that it was because of Lucerne's image, which was so different from what she had seen in her past life. Although at the same time, they did not meet in person very often, but even these meetings created a certain image. She learned all the information about him, mainly from the terrible rumors that literally followed him on his heels. Compared to all these rumors, he is much gentle and caring. But at that very second, the girl covered her mouth. Then she began to turn her head, trying to drive away these thoughts, because she had never thought about such things before. Suddenly, Elisha noticed with surprise two maids talking anxiously. She immediately became interested in what had happened. Since Sophie had such a serious face, apparently something serious had happened. Without wasting any time, she got out of bed, asking what happened. The maids immediately turned their attention to her. Meanwhile, in the next room, the maids unsuccessfully escorted people out, while the knights tried to restrain Nora. Ian and Corinne held the girl tightly, demanding that she stop. But she didn't even think about giving in. She cried out loudly that she had failed to fulfill her knightly duty, which had put her mistress in danger. At that very second, the girl froze when she heard Elisha's voice, and she asked her with a serious face what she was doing. Nora immediately relaxed, after which the two knights immediately released her, hoping that she would not break down again. After a couple of seconds, everyone decided to leave the room, leaving the lady alone with the knight for a private conversation. Elisha said that a knight's life belonged to his master, but she decided not to take responsibility for it. Instead, she chose to run away, which is completely out of character, or maybe it's her way of taking responsibility. Suddenly, Elisha handed her a napkin on which lay a bracelet of flowers, which she immediately recognized. The girl asked if she remembered the dried pansies that everyone in the monastery received when they took the oath. This thing surprised Nora, who couldn't even find the words to ask how she knew about it. Elisha said she knew she grew up in a monastery, and she too, in the monastery of Archbishop Rosary. Although immediately after leaving there, she ended up in the hands of Cartier, and she became a knight, which is why they did not meet. She added that a person who truly shines in his place is like a light shining from afar. And for her, she is exactly that kind of person, so she must promise that she will not do anything like that again. Nora immediately fell on one knee before her, solemnly declaring that she would lay down her life to protect her. Meanwhile, at the royal palace, Ilion told Lucerne that she understood today why he took the day off, after which, with a hint of malice in her voice, she declared that his wife was a real beauty, with whom it wouldn't be a sin to spend time. The man frowned, saying that he had not given her permission to call him by his name, which surprised her. Even though she has been calling him that since childhood, now he has a wife, and so she needs to refrain from doing that. Poking him in the shoulder, the princess asked why he was so cruel, and this despite their strong and friendly relationship. However, she immediately fell silent when she noticed his displeased and burning gaze, deciding not to continue. After clearing her throat, she declared that she understood everything and would now call him General, regardless of time and place. Walking further forward, Lucerne calmly asked how she knew he had booked a hotel yesterday. Ilione replied that he never introduced his wife, so she became curious, and then apologized. And then she looked at him, thinking that she had known him for a very long time, and they were quite close in a friendly way. However, sometimes something flashes through him that makes her involuntarily cringe, but she has never seen him smile. Quickening her pace and keeping her hands behind her back, the princess decided to ask what kind of person his wife was and why he chose her. She hoped that he did not treat Elisha the same way as she did, because noble ladies were quite sensitive. Lucerne replied that she had only the manners of a noble lady, although she was extremely cautious, but unbending. And she also has hundreds of different thoughts in her head that he doesn't even know about. She's a very interesting girl. Suddenly turning around, the princess looked at his face in shock, seeing the general smile for the first time with her own eyes. 3 days later, the aristocrats were whispering that the general had received the fief and the Noren forest as trophies after the war. Before this, he did not have a noble title, and everything went to the country. It seems that it was not in vain that he got married and received a title. They say his wife did not show up for the receptions because she was feeling unwell, but that is very hard to believe. Everyone decided that this was a contract marriage. Although 3 days ago, Baroness Aden personally saw the general and his wife at the hotel. Lucerne, who was present at the reception, listening in on their conversations, decided that he was tired of it all. But there was still a matter that needed to be sorted out. He also remembered Elisha and her condition after what had happened. Suddenly, an image of his wife appeared in his head, lying in bed and gently clinging to his hand. The general immediately shuddered as he realized with surprise that he was now thinking about her without any reason. Then he rose from his seat, deciding that this was enough to please the emperor, and now it was time to return. At that very moment, Ian stood in his way, immediately approached him, and began to whisper information to him. He then bowed low, adding that it seemed they wanted to see how he would react to the insult. Lucerne clenched his fists, asking if they were interested in whether he would throw out his defiled wife or not. The man headed for the exit, concluding that he would have to delay his return home a little for the sake of business. Looking at Marquis Fulman, who was enjoying himself with the guests, the general ordered the knight to prepare everything. The Marquis is one of those people who tremble over the secrecy of his personal life and is very afraid of his wealthy wife, because it was thanks to her blood ties to the royal family that he was able to re-establish his lineage. To be honest, he was actually afraid of losing her money and was currently chained to a chair. When he came to, he was horrified to see Lucerne sitting in front of him, calmly smoking a cigarette. After taking a drag, the general turned to him and said that he seemed to have a very bad hobby, a gambling house. Just an hour ago, the Marquis was sitting surrounded by 2 girls, saying that he was incredibly lucky today. Suddenly, a worker came out to him, telling the dear client that he had already managed to win 3 games in a row. Ian came up to me in a dealer's uniform and said with a smile that he even took the girls with him and had a lot of fun. The Marquis was shocked and could not believe his eyes as he introduced himself as a knight from the Order of the Black Lion. Fulman asked how he dared to do this, since he was an aristocrat of the empire, and this was just a gambling house. At that very moment, a bag containing various instruments fell in front of the prisoner's feet. He was immediately overcome with fear, after which he began to shout to the general that there had clearly been some kind of misunderstanding. Lucerne approached him, asking if he thought he would get away with it after touching his wife. The general also asked more angrily whether he should not have been prepared for this, since everything in this world has to be paid for. Ian asked him not to worry, because when it was all over, the best wizards of the empire would erase his memory. He will open his eyes already in the hotel, in a state of intoxication, with traces of sexual intercourse, and not remembering anything. Taking a hammer in his hand, Lucerne told the Marquis that his wife would be so upset when she found out about her husband's infidelity. The next morning, Lapis walked down the corridor where he had taught the Marquis a lesson the day before, when he decided to attack his mistress. If only he had not been ordered to remain silent, he would have certainly bragged to her about his deed. Suddenly, he noticed a maid who was standing a step away from Elisha's chambers and was about to go inside. He asked Sophie what it was, and she replied with a smile that it was today's newspaper and that she was going to take it to the lady. Hearing this, the wizard's face began to slowly change, after which his eyes burned with determination to do so. The maid couldn't stop admiring such a sweet face. I understand why Lapis is trying so hard to charm her. She asked him to pass it on to her instead, after which the guy practically ran into Elisha's room. The girl politely invited him inside, asking with a smile on her face if he would like a cup of tea. Instead of a direct answer, the guy announced that he had brought a newspaper, but as soon as he saw the headline, he immediately froze. The wizard abruptly hid the newspaper behind his back, while the surprised Elisha asked if something had happened. Lapis became nervous, not knowing what to answer, when suddenly he heard a question about whether they had written anything interesting in the newspaper. The front page featured a photo of Lucerne and Ilione, and Lapis didn't understand why that particular article had appeared. At the same time, a carriage arrived at the mansion, from which a general emerged, who was immediately greeted by the servants. At the same time, Lapis distracted Alicia and led him to the table, loudly declaring that he wanted to eat the apple right now. Throwing aside the crumpled newspaper, he added that he had been dying to eat it long before he came here. Elisha replied that she should tell the maid, but a few minutes later she personally peeled the apple for him. And now he suddenly eats apples cut personally by the lady, but all the newspapers in the mansion will have to be burned. Elisha said she heard that there was an article about the princess and Lucerne on the front page of today's newspaper. This shocked the wizard. Then he looked at the smiling girl, who asked if he wanted more. Meanwhile, Henri said he was surprised when he returned at night without warning a few days ago, and he left at dawn, so he was worried that he didn't even get a proper rest from the journey. Lucerne replied that nothing was expected to happen anytime soon, so he shouldn't be so busy. Looking at the office, he said he felt a strong discrepancy with what he had seen there last time. The butler replied that a lot had changed in the 2 months he had been away, and they had done a general cleaning, all thanks to the lady, planning the placement of items in the house, and organizing the storage of expensive things, increasing the efficiency of servants, raising people's desire to work. She did all this single-handedly. The general listened to this with an indifferent expression on his face, only answering that these were significant changes. The man then turned around, hearing one of the maids asking how she could not give it to him. Looking into those eyes, Sophie added with a smile that the lady should definitely know how much Mr. Lapis loved her. By clearing his throat, the general attracted attention to himself, which immediately made the maids nervous and bowed low. At that very moment, a joyful Corin came in with food in his hands and asked the butler where the lady was now. He wanted to say that he brought a lot of food, but when he saw Lucerne's displeased look, he immediately fell silent and froze. The two maids and the knight were embarrassed under the languid gaze of the gentleman, who had remained silent the entire time. He then said that everyone was so eager to meet his dear wife, whom he himself had not even seen yet. He asked the butler about this, who shuddered, answering that the lady was a very kind and caring person. These words brought a smile to the face of the general, who repeated the butler's comment with a hint of irony. The man explained that she had independently resolved the servant's difficulties and even dealt with the food problem. Lucerne frowned, thinking that she was only being so cautious towards him, which could not be said about the others. Corinne and the maid looked at Henri, while he watched the gentleman, who sighed heavily, covering his face with his hand. The man then turned his head towards him, saying that he needed to see his wife, and then asked where she was now. At this time, Lapis asked if the content of this article upset her. Elisha did not know what to answer. She knew that the general and the princess were not in such a relationship. She was absolutely sure of it. Besides, even if there is something between them, she still can't do anything about it, no matter how much she wants to. Hearing such speeches, the wizard immediately asked if he should teach the general a lesson, which brought a smile to the girl's face. At this time, standing behind the open door, Lucerne listened attentively to their friendly and carefree dialogue. Suddenly, the smile disappeared from Elisha's face when she noticed her husband enter the room without warning. He frowned, stating that it seemed like he had interrupted their friendly and carefree time. Then he approached the upset Lapis, asking him to go away from here and not bother the lady of this house. The dissatisfied guy took the plate, replying that the lady had never said that he was annoying her with his presence. However, seeing the general's displeased look, he immediately headed for the exit. The man asked to leave the plate. A few seconds later, Lucerne sat down on the sofa, after which he stared at the plate with the peeled apple. Elisha swallowed, trying to figure out why he looked like he was in a bad mood right now. Looking at his expression and behavior, the girl realized that she could not understand his intentions at all. When she decided to clear the plate, Lucerne immediately asked her why she never peeled his apples for him. Elisha replied that if he wanted apples, then she would call Sophie. Suddenly his gaze went to the newspaper. Taking it in his hands, the man replied that he wanted to eat something peeled by her hands, be it an apple or a peach. Then he smiled slyly and asked if, since that was the case, she could feed him right in bed. This proposal confused the girl, who replied that he had come home after so much time and had immediately started his own business. He grabbed her hand, saying that he thought she had just bewitched him, but it turned out that was not the case. They then clasped their hands, as the general said that it seemed like everyone in the house was in love with her. Alicia did not resist, but tried to understand what he was talking about and when she had ever cast a spell on someone. Kissing her hand, Lucerne reminded her that she had undressed on the first day of their meeting and had sneaked into his room at night. She even somehow managed to drag him down the aisle, and this despite the fact that he never intended to get married. He then asked her to look into his eyes, after which he embraced the embarrassed girl in a tender kiss. Without wasting any time, he asked her to take off her clothes, as he wanted to look at her after so much time. She thought he had had a good time with the princess in the palace, and now wanted to satisfy his needs. Of course, nothing could be done, since she was his wife by contract. But now the girl sensed injustice, which caused Elisha to frown, replying that she didn't want to undress alone because it was too embarrassing. The man smiled, then quickly pulled his shirt off, asking if she was happy now. The girl became even more embarrassed when she saw the general's half-naked body, and then she noticed something. On the left side of his chest, she found a scar, after which she asked what it was. Lucerne replied that he received it in the temple. He explained that, as a child, he lived in the temple under the guidance of his uncle Merk, as a result of which he received it. Alicia looked at him incredulously, wondering why he lived there, but was able to get such a serious wound. The general replied that if an orphan living there did something bad, he would be whipped as punishment. Elisha decided to ask if he was a bad child. Lucerne replied that, by their standards, apparently he was. He then suggested that they end the conversation, after which he abruptly pushed the girl onto the bed, hanging over her. Leaning over, the man said he could no longer hold back, but her body was too weak to hurry. Doing it slowly would not be easy. At this time, Elisha felt strange, but at the same time, good. As the evening approached, they lay in bed, completely tired from spending time together. Elisha did not sleep, noticing that it was already night, which meant that they had been making love all day. Suddenly, Lucerne hugged her, asking if she was awake. She replied that she couldn't even move properly. The man asked her to get up, wash herself, and put on something nice, as he wanted to eat outside. He reminded them that they had not managed to do this last time, and now was the perfect time. The girl blushed and was surprised, not understanding why he decided to eat so late, and even outside the mansion. Some time later, they reached a restaurant, where the visitors, noticing them, began to whisper. The waiter greeted them, while Elisha noticed that all eyes were on Lucerne. Looking at him, she couldn't understand whether it was because she was beautiful or there was some other reason. But when he said he would grow old while they waited for a place here, she realized it was all because of his bad reputation. When they took a free table, the general politely pulled out her chair, showing his wife his manners. Lucerne noticed Elisha's wandering gaze, causing him to frown and ask curiously if she was looking for something. The girl replied that the offer came so unexpectedly, so she thought that he wanted to introduce her to someone. The first thing she thought of was the princess, but the general, pouring wine, did not understand what she was talking about. He said with a smile that he was having dinner with his wife, and that there was no need for any unnecessary introductions now. Elisha was pleasantly surprised by this answer, but she had mixed feelings about him calling her his wife. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by a man running out from behind the far door, practically naked. He screamed hysterically that it was a man dressed as a girl, and that he had attacked him some time ago. It was the Marquis of Fulman, who was covered from head to toe in bruises and lipstick marks from kisses. The girls who noticed this sight began to ask each other if this was not a staircase leading to the hotel. Another one suggested taking a look at him. He looked like he had just been caught cheating on his wife. Elisha was shocked to recognize the man as Carol's father, but he didn't look very good. Fulman grabbed the worker by the leg and asked him to hide him, but he was told that a customer should not behave like that. He then grabbed the man and led him deeper into the room while he struggled furiously and screamed that he was looking for him. Looking at this, Elisha tried to understand why the Count, who was known for his excellent relationship with his wife, looked like this. Meanwhile, Lucerne, who was leisurely enjoying his wine, said with a smile that it was an interesting spectacle. Elisha remembered how in her past life, one of the maids hit her on Carol's orders for another mistake. The aristocrat said with a smile that not long ago, her mother had asked a famous fortune teller for a prediction. Then she asked if she knew what she had told her, and replied that some sinister person had attached himself to Jacob. Carol thought about it in a demonstrative and feigned manner, adding that this bitch also steals absolutely all her men. She became curious about who this girl was that was constantly hanging around him. Alicia immediately understood what she was getting at. Now the girl was sitting in a restaurant and drinking wine, but memories still involuntarily crept into her head. She also recalled being pulled into a storage room by several men, loudly mocking her. Among them was Count Fulman, who asked how she dared to stretch out her hands to his daughter's man. Because of her, Carol is now sad and crying bitterly, even though Elisha didn't do it. But no one will believe her anyway. All sorts of things happened to her, but it is these memories that show the very relationship the Fulman family had with her. Their entire family was filled with an unshakable conviction that she was desperate to get Carol's man. However, now she thought that some unpleasant situation must have served as a reason. Lucerne asked with interest what she was thinking about so deeply. The girl shuddered, answering that it was about nothing. After returning, her memories seem incomplete. She remembers most of the events, but not completely. The general smiled, saying that she was still looking in that direction, which meant that she was interested in the situation. Then he decided to ask if she felt sorry for him. Alicia was surprised, because she did not expect him to ask such a question. In response, the girl asked who he was so that she could feel sorry for him, and he replied that he was the Marquis of Fulman, Carol's father. Alicia immediately frowned, looking closely at her husband, deciding that he was probing her right now.